fingers in the ears are strictly prohibited.
All right, we'll take it right away. I'll start by thanking Chambanacon and Brenda Sutton for inviting us here to do this interview. It's a great honor for me. Mr. Wolfe is my favorite author, and I always enjoy getting a chance to,
Thank you.
to talking to him. Myself and Mr. Busboom are representatives of the Gene Wolfe Appreciation Society Facebook group. We're 631 strong.
Cool.
We have a variety of different backgrounds and exposures and whatnot. There are some people who teach college level courses about Mr. Wolfe's writing. There's others who are just discovering him for the first time. So we always have great conversations. A lot of the questions that we're going to be asking are drawn from that group.
If only I could get them to wear uniforms.
You asked him to, I bet they would.
Yeah.
If you made it a t-shirt, you probably could do that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, shall we dive right in?
Sure, yeah. First question I think we were gonna go with was, has your writing process changed over the years, and if so, how?
I'm not sure what you mean by writing process. So,
Like, how you go from an idea to a first draft and then to a subsequent draft. Like, did that, has the way you write and the way you go about the kind of nuts and bolts work of it changed significantly? Or?
I don't think it's changed to any significant degree. I write things and then go over them again, and change things that I think should be changed and clarify things that I think should be clarified. And I've always done that.
Okay.
One of the changes in the content that a number of us have noticed is that in some of your earlier works, you put lots of little touchstones in referencing other authors and works and what have you. Like, for example, you have a robot detective in one story who grows fungus in his basement, and he offhand remarks that one of these funguses is from Yugoth. Lovecraft reference, just to touch something fun.
Yeah.
But in more recent works, it seems like these extra textual sources are informing more of the story. Maybe it's the key to understanding how it's framed.
Maybe. I think they know more about my work than I do.
So is that incidental? That's not a conscious decision then?
No, I don't think it's a conscious decision. I just write the thing the way that I want to write it and look it over again. Say, oh golly, I forgot to mention dogs, and go back and put the dogs in, it's called putting on a dog. And
On the dog.
oh, some people laugh.
Are there any stories or novels that you started long ago and left unfinished?
No.
Okay.
Really?
That answers that.
That's really interesting to me. I mean, you. One of the ways I've described it to other people who ask me about you is, and especially in your short stories, you're like you create a literary playground that it seems like you're having a bunch of different imaginings within, and you're inviting the readers to come along with you. I mean,
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of that. What it really means is you should have more than one idea. You know what I mean? This is a very simple support.
Mm-hmm.
This is much more complicated support, much more complex. And I think the more complex one is better, because the idea here is to entertain the reader. I'm not trying to teach sociology or any such thing as that. I'm trying to write a good story that quite a number of people will read with enjoyment.
Now you've dabbled in a number of different kinds of stories. I mean, you've
Sure.
science fiction obviously is what you're best known for, but I mean you've written detective stories. You've written ones with a pirate bent. You've done at least one weird story, the Lord of the Land kind of a Lovecraftian kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any particular style that that really resonated with you, that you clicked in a way more than others, or is there any that maybe you decided you tried on and you didn't so much care for?
I can't think of one, to tell you the truth. It depends on what the subject matter I want to write about is. And some subjects are better written in certain ways or certain settings. And I try to put a subject where I think it ought to go.
You told me that you've written far more nonfiction than you've written fiction. And
I suppose I have, but that's because I was an editor for, I believe, 11 years on a magazine. And when I couldn't get stories from contributors, I had to write the stories.
Oh.
And then I also had to write either 3 or 4, depending on how things went for the magazine, either 3 or 4 cover stories, which occupied, frankly, a lot of time and a lot of research to do a good job on, why are left-handed monkey wrenches so expensive and all that stuff.
Is any of that material collected anywhere or accessible anywhere? Do you know?
Not as far as I know.
There's a bit of a yearning for that on the Facebook page. Several people were asking about that.
Well, my magazine articles would not entertain you, I'm sure. I have a degree in engineering, and I was working for an engineering magazine and writing engineering articles for our readership. We had one editor who was concerned with pushing around piles of sand, and I was concerned with things like V-belts and gears and welding and various other things. I ended up with a lot of jobs. I was letters to the editor, and I was cartoon editor. That was a post I invented for myself. Because it's really hard if you have a magazine that's published every 2 weeks, which is what we were doing. It's really hard to come up with letters to the editor column for each issue. And I went to the point of getting some science fiction writers that I knew had technical backgrounds or engineering degrees or whatever, and writing to them and saying, please write us a letter. There are 3 copies in the magazine. Write us a letter, please. I need you. And they came through for me. They wrote, and you look in there and say, gee, Tucker, there's an article from Tucker in here. But nobody ever did. I kind of expected I was going to get letters on that, but never happened. It never happened. The thing that drove you crazy, if you were letters to the editor, as I was that the editors would receive a letter from some reader, They would read it, they would write a reply to the reader. They would then throw away the reader's letter, and they would bring me their reply. No, so help me God, this went on, and it went on a lot more than once. And you thought, for criminy, can't you understand that the idea of this column is letters from readers? It's not replies from our editors. It's what are the readers writing to us. That's the primary thing. And they would kind of stare at me and go and get some coffee.
You mentioned getting help from other science fiction writers at the time, and I think last year at this convention you discussed with Nathan Carson sort of the behind-the-scenes stuff with the TV interview you did with Isaac Asimov and Harlan Ellison.
Oh, yeah.
I was wondering if you could maybe regale us with any other anecdotes about some of the other greats of the genre.
Oh my, I don't know. Criminy. If Harlan Ellison alone is not enough for you, he was, I hate it that I'm saying was, but he was a show all by himself. He was just amazing. We went through a thing where I stood at attention, and he bawled me out as Sergeant would bawl out a private, and tried to make me take it seriously. I was trying to suppress the smile. I knew the whole thing was pretty silly, and I was not going to cry or any of the stuff that he expected me to do. Say something. Somebody say
Who
something.
do you like besides Harlan Ellison?
What?
Who do you hold in high esteem besides?
Oh, Isaac Asimov, very much so. I got to associate with Isaac a fair amount, and wish I had been able to associate with him much more. The problem with Isaac, and I know how absurd this sounds, but it's true, he would not fly.
Oh,
He lived on the West Coast and he wouldn't fly. And when he came east, he took the train. Think a science fiction writer, and he won't climb on board an airplane. I think, what the hell is going on here? I took my first flight ever was in a spotter, an Army two-seater plane that was used to spot targets for artillery. And that you felt like you were really flying, because you looked out and the wings were going like this, and it was, it made all the commercial flying that I have done later seem very much like boarding a bus. But that little two-seater, that was flying. That was what the Wright brothers did,
Did you know R.A. Lafferty?
Oh, yes.
I
knew him well, yeah.
Yeah, I read an afterword to a story you had written, which you included a character that was basically based on Lafferty, and in that you had said that you thought that he deserved to be much more widely read.
Yeah, well, I knew Lafferty and liked him, in fact. If you need a character, you pull out whatever you can find. It's sort of like fishing. You don't know what's on the other end of the hook, but you know you're going to fillet it.
several people asked about anecdotes of other writers, and I don't know how well you knew or if you knew these, but the most frequently mentioned were Frank Herbert, Jack Vance, and Ursula Le Guin. I wondered if you had any
I knew
stories.
Ursula fairly well. I remember being devastated when she died, frankly. I was a house guest of the Le Guins for a while. I don't know, 2 nights, 3 nights, something like that. And could look out and I've forgotten the name of the volcano now, but you could look out and see a volcano that had been in the news a lot because it had erupted recently and it had a lava flow, you know, down the sides and so forth. And that was really kind of spooky. You thought, gee, I hope I'm out of reach of all this stuff. And you knew that it was going on underground and it could come up, you know, like a shark jumping. Hoped it didn't get me.
Yeah.
Or her, for that matter. Ursula came from a couple of very distinguished scholars who were her parents, male and female. And they were the ones who had latched on to this Indian that they found who had grown up alone. He had been a little kid when people who did not like Indians came in and wiped out his tribe. They killed everybody that they could find, and they missed one little boy. And he had been a little boy, you know, and he had lived in the woods through his adolescence, and finally decided it might be safe. There was a village of white men, you know, near the forest where he lived. And he went into the village and started looking around and so forth, and people said, oh my God, he's an Indian and he can't speak English or understand it or anything else. Anthropologists latched on to him and all that. Probably the oddest person I have ever known. Again, maybe. Although some of you, no, not really.
So how
Not
did the Le
really.
Guins get
Hmm?
him? So how did the Le Guins find him?
What?
How did the Le Guins find him?
They found him because he came in.
Okay, so they just took him into their house.
Well, people realized what he was, and this couple who were a male and a female professor had just latched on to him and taken care of him and made sure that things were all right for him. Yes,
Was
sir.
this the person, I have a childhood memory of a book called, I think, Issue of Two Worlds.
Hmm?
Was that the individual?
I believe it was.
So I remember reading, I think, as a schoolboy, you know, and I think in a competitor to My Weekly Reader or something like that, around 6th or 7th grade, in abridgment about him.
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting story, I think, because kids kind of think, you know, or dream, or however you want to call it. What if I were on my own, you know, no parents and so on. And if you look at boys' books, you'll find an awful lot of kids in that situation. you know, the only older relative they have is their one grandfather who is the captain of a battleship. All that was a series of English books that then got kind of imitated by an American writer who did it, only he did it with Americans, where the English writer had done it with Englishmen and English boys. Surprise. Battleship Boys, I think, was the name of the English series. And it was boys' books for English boys about two boys whose father had died, and their only living relative was their grandfather, who was the captain of a battleship. Went on from there. You know, by a very obvious setup for a series of boys' books. It was sold quite well in England, and a very similar series then came up in America.
That actually jogs to mind another question somebody was asking. Is there a particular work of yours that you think would be a good entry for a younger reader? Maybe a young
Oh
adult?
boy, I'd like to go over that. I'd like to go through my bookcase and think about that. I'm not going to name anything offhand. I'm sure that some books would be much better for that purpose than others, but I'd want to go through and have a hard look at things.
There's a couple that was suggested when I asked some other people the question. The Devil in the Forest came up. Pandora by Holly Hollander. I got my goddaughter The Night. That was the entry piece that I got for her.
The Knife?
The Night.
Oh, The Night, pardon me. I thought you said The Knife. Ah.
At a previous Chambanacon, I think this was 2 years ago, I was the first time I really got to sort of meet you. I mean, I'd met you briefly at a WindyCon, I think, first. But 2 years ago, I kind of sat and chatted with you in the con suite for the first time. And you talked about the Island of Dr. Moreau, and speaking of sort of young, or influences at a young age. I was wondering if you could speak more about that, or other books that influenced you early on.
Well, there used to be a class of pulp magazines, and today they are extinct as far as I can see. But in the old days, I could go up to the Richmond Pharmacy and I could get Analog and Amazing and Weird Tales, a number of things like that. And they carried some very good stories. And sometimes Weird Tales would devote an entire issue to something that they were doing. And they did one for the Island of Dr. Moreau. And I was probably 14, 15 at the time. And I read it, and from the last word, I went back to the first word, and I read it again, and from the last word, I went back to the first word, and I read it again, and from the last word, I went back to the first word, and discovered that I knew everything that was going to happen and what everybody was going to say. I was, I don't know, what, 15 or whatever it was. I said, well, I won't read this again until I'm not as familiar with it as I am now, and then I'll go back and get it. And I was asked when I was about 50 to write an article about the island of Dr. Moreau. I probably had referenced it in conversation to somebody. I suspect he had filed it and said, here it is, I'm doing this book now, introductions of great science fiction and fantasy books that you may or may not know anything about. And I'll get Gene to write about the island of Dr. Moreau. So I pulled it out and I read it again. And it was all this neat stuff that had gone right over my head when I had read it before, you know? And the one that stuck with me is when they rescue the narrator, or when the narrator is rescued. He's rescued by Dr. Moreau's personal physician. And he says I was given something to drink that looked like blood and made me feel stronger. And when I had read that as a kid, I had gone right by it. And when I read it as an adult, I damn near dropped the book because I realized what the author, who wrote The Island of Dr. Moreau,
H.G.
Wells, was doing was really, grabbing me by the belt with this thing. I had not realized it when I read it the first 4 or 5 times, whatever it was. It's a hell of a story. It really is.
Now, since you bring up Wells, one of the things I've noticed with stories from his era and even a little before is there's a line of pessimism that runs through it often. And for example, the time machine that goes to the future, humanity's segmented out. Here's these naive know-nothings and these underground people who harvest them. Lovecraft has a lot of pessimism, and his inherently, people encounter things that are too big for the human mind to handle, and it destroys them. But in your works, I've noticed that you take it a different way. I mean, you've looked much farther into the future in your stories, and first of all, humanity's still there, which is an optimistic thing in and of itself. But like for example, Spherian, I mean, he doesn't understand all of the things that are going on with what's happening with him throughout his story. He goes off world and things that are much bigger than he does. He's encountering, but he brings a new son. So it's it almost seems like it's, I don't want to say antithetical, but it's a different paradigm that you're engaging with those kinds of things with than these earlier authors.
I agree with what you said. You have a question based on that, or does anybody in the audience have a question based on it?
So
Yes, sir.
I think maybe in relation to the earlier authors who kind of take a pessimistic view, whereas as Andy was saying, you tend to take a more optimistic view. Maybe why is that? Why did you decide for these characters to use Severian again as an example? That he doesn't just go mad when he realizes when all this is happening to him, that he still goes on, the world goes on, and things kind of continue.
I'm sorry, I seem to have missed the heart of the question. What
Sure.
is it now?
So I guess why when characters in your stories encounter large, incomprehensible realities of the divine or the extraterrestrial, rather than what we see in Wells or Lovecraft, where these characters, they go mad by encountering these things, your characters, I guess, don't. They continue on, and there's kind of an optimistic feeling to it that things will go on after this. This could be good. What
Why
was
the
your draw to that?
optimism as opposed to the pessimism?
Yes.
Well, because I think that's the way it's going to be. There he lies, and he's got 4 or 5 bullets in him, and he's bleeding all over, and he's dead. But my life goes on. I'm going to go to the mess hall and get lunch in about a half an hour. Somebody will come by, there are people who are detailed to do this. Get the body and take it away. I don't have to worry about that. Maybe I should say, I was an infantryman in Korea at the time of the Korean War. Fought Chinese. People think we were fighting the North Koreans. By the time I got there, the North Korean army had been wiped out. It was gone utterly. And there's a North Korean army now, you understand, but they've had all that time to recover and get a new crop of people up. But in those days, they had been killed, and we were fighting the Chinese army, Red China. And, you know, we killed them when we could, and we captured them when we could. We captured a few here and there, and treated them well, and turned them over to intelligence, who would question them, try to get, you know, some useful information out of them. God knows whether they did. I don't know.
So is it a fair statement to say that these experiences, and then emphasized in your writing and how your characters act, that you feel that the human person is much more robust, more capable of dealing with those kinds of traumas and pressing on than maybe some of these other authors?
We have so far. Have you noticed we're not extinct?
We're not extinct.
Well, you know, we're having to preserve animals like the lions and tigers and the grizzly bears and so on. Who are we preserving them from, or what are we preserving them from? We're preserving them from us, because we'll kill them if we don't act to protect them. And there were huge, beautiful stags in Ireland, if you go back to well, hundreds of years. And what has happened to them? Well, they've all been killed by people. That's what's happened to them. They've been wiped out. We know that they existed because we find bones and antlers and so on from them.
Switching gears just a little bit, but I mean, what you were just saying clicks into place. I'm aware that you are a vast repository of anecdotes and stories and things that you've sucked up like a sponge, it seems. And you know, in your writings, they're very apparent. I mean, we have the stories of the ship of St. Brendan and the Banshee, and you conflate at one point the Minotaur and the Battle of Hampton Roads.
Oh, yeah.
All these different pieces.
Yeah,
You know,
the ship, the minute.
yeah, right. You know, all these different things. Is there a way that you go about organizing those disparate stories when you actually go about to write a work of your own? I mean, I'm imagining you with, you know, one of those conspiracy cork boards with lines running all over the place, and this is going to connect to this, and this is going to.
I definitely do not have anything with lines running all over the place.
Is it all in your head?
Yeah, I guess it's all in my head. I read about something, or I hear about something, or I see something. Think that's going to make a good story, and so I'll pitch in and write it. And if I'm lucky, I'll sell it. Yeah. That's the business.
You've advised writers in the past, I believe, to start with short stories and work your way up to novels.
That's the way almost everybody who succeeds goes. not everybody,
Right.
but almost everybody who succeeds does that. They start writing short stories because you get feedback so fast on your short stories. You can get feedback on novels too, but it takes a lot longer for you to write the novel and then get the feedback.
Right.
So write some short stories. See what the editor has to say if he says anything. If he says anything to you, you came close.
Right.
Otherwise, you just get your manuscript back with a rejection slip or whatever, at least. I'm kind of out of touch with what's going on now because my stuff is submitted by my agent and not by me. So I'm assuming that things are about the way they used to be when I submitted my own work.
With your own development of your stories, as you're known for your meticulous rewrites and making sure everything connects appropriately.
Try.
Did you bring your family into that process? I mean, I know you your writings are developed a little later in life than some. You know, you were married, you had some kids during that development time. I mean, did you ever bounce ideas off of them, or?
I may have bounced ideas, particularly off my wife, but I don't recall it much. It probably happened to some extent anyway. Of course, I've lost Rosemary now, and actually I lost her long before she died because she, you know, got ill and deteriorated mentally, and it was very, very sad thing to see, particularly if you were her husband and loved her. But I did love her, and she loved me. What I remember is no, well, you don't want to hear this. I won't.
I probably would.
I would.
But
Yeah, that's why we're sitting here.
Anybody else?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever been approached by producers for movies or TV about your work? And
No,
no one's ever shown interest?
not for television, no.
I know several years ago, there was a comic book graphic novel treatment of at least the first part of the Book of the New Sun. How did they work with you on the adaptation?
They got in touch with my agent and said, we want to do this. And the agent said, well, we're happy to have you do that. It's just that we want to cut. And, you know, contracts were signed and off it went. That's what the agency is for, or one of the things that the agency is for. Why I've got an agent.
Did they contact you for feedback on how they handled the adaptation?
Yeah, they told me it was, that they had gotten it, and this is what they said, and I wrote back and said, you know, hooray. It seems to me that you're handling everything right, which it did. Of course, they're professional literary agents, you know, they know the game.
do you think your work is well suited to a visual medium? Just strikes me that that would be very difficult.
I think some is and some isn't. I think you would have to, we would have to both read the same story and then talk about that story or that book. And with books, there's sort of a social error that we've got in our civilization currently, that people want to make movies based on novels. And novels are too big for, to be swallowed in one movie. And as a result, you get this chopping off and simplification and all this so that they can get it into a 90-minute or longer film. You go and see the movie and you think you know the story, but it's not the same as if you had read it.
Have you ever encountered any of your works on audiobook? Have you ever listened to any of the productions?
Yes, I've listened to some of those.
That's another medium, and I take lots of long car rides, so I appreciate that people have done that. But I find I enjoy reading your work more than listening to somebody else. But
It's intended to be read. I don't, you know, there are children's books writers who write books that are intended to be read aloud to children. And I'm not writing those. I assume that my readers are adults and they're not reading aloud to anyone. They're sitting in the living room and flipping through, whatever.
yeah, and there was one audiobook I listened to in the car on a couple of long car rides, The Land Across, which takes place in a fictitious Eastern European country, and the man who did it, I don't remember his name right now, but the voices he did were very impressive. I mean, he dramatized the characters in a very entertaining way. Dramatized, yeah. Right. But I was always wondering, does he really understand what's going on? Is he dramatizing it in the correct way?
He certainly doesn't understand everything, I guarantee. Well, because he is thrown into a culture, nation that is contrary in various ways to his experience, and he's feeling his way along. How does an Italian immigrant feel if he lands in Boston and starts trying to make a living there? It's not like Sicily or wherever it was he came from.
Yeah, a lot of your works I've seen, just in the interior thoughts of the characters. There's so much compacted in there. And one particular example that at this point I had to set the book down, or the book I was reading down, because it changed my view. But I was reading The Death of Dr. Island, and in that story you have kind of a capsule that's off Jupiter somewhere, and people are put into this capsule for therapy, and it follows around this main character, and he's got his brain's been cut in half to prevent seizures, and so there's only one half of his brain that's engaging. But at one point in the narration, it's not part of dialogue or anything like that, but he's observing there and towards the end of the story, and suddenly you have the line, for the love of God, Montresor. one of those little touchstones again, that I mentioned earlier. And it suddenly was like, wait a second. And I suddenly realized there was this whole tension that was going on through all the things that hadn't been said. And like I said, I just had to set it down. I was like, oh, for crying out loud, you got me again.
If you were about to be walled in, you'd feel the same way.
But yeah, just wonderful things like that. But I mean, it's so complex. It's hard to put that out there in those different forms.
It's such a horrible death. It has haunted me ever since I first read about it. Take a living person and wall him into a cell with no door.
Do you listen to audiobooks often? I know you mentioned in
No, I don't, because when I do listen to them, it's when I'm on a long drive had any reason to. Now I try and remember why it was that I did it when I did it. Sometimes I was going cons, you know, and various other things.
Are you able to read much nowadays?
Not as much as I'd like. My problem is that my eyes won't take it. I can read for probably half an hour or 45 minutes, maybe, depending on the type size. And then I have to stop. And when I was a kid, in summer, particularly when I didn't have to go to school, I would be reading 12 hours, you know, of a day I would spend reading. I remember going out, we had a shady tree in the backyard in those days. I would go out and sit in the shade with several books and read for hours. You know.
I have a question, sir. You were talking about that your own works have not been adapted to the TV, etc. But are there any works that by anybody that you know of that you particularly do like that have been adapted? Anybody else's works?
That I would like to have adapted.
That you've seen by other people that have been adapted to TV or movies that you think are particularly good? That have already been adapted?
Well, that's very easy to find, I think. Hemingway, for example. Wells. Both of them are very fine writers, in my opinion. Hemingway gets hammered at occasions like these because he wrote short sentences. People seem to think that he could not have written long ones if he wanted. But of course he didn't want. He does this staccato prose, which I think is very effective for the kind of material that he's generally writing.
Switching gears a little bit, but thinking along the lines of interpretations of works and bringing them from point A to point B. I know you get a lot of fan theories about what this means or what that means. And you've also commented in some previous interviews that sometimes a landing on Mars is just a landing on Mars. But are there any fan theories that have struck you as particularly outlandish that you just couldn't believe that somebody had read into this in that particular way?
I'm sure there have been. I'm not sure now what any of them were, but you get people. There used to be a guy in Wisconsin who was absolutely stone nuts. I mean, this guy was crazy, and he would write to me, and he would write his interpretations of some story or novel of mine, and I'd read it and think, I didn't write that. He's reading all this stuff into it, and it isn't there. It's in his mind, not in mine. And of course, you can get some of the same stuff from reviewers. Sometimes people whose duty it is to review books will come up with stuff that you read it, think, he didn't read my book. What did he read? Because he didn't read my book, you know. He's saying things happened that did not happen. And he's skipping over the things that did happen. And what's going on here? Well, he was given the book and asked to have a column in 2 days, and he didn't feel like reading the book in 2 days and writing his column. He probably opened a book somewhere, read a few pages, started writing his column.
Wow.
It happens, you know.
In the things that you write, I mean, obviously you take very large ideas and you sometimes present them very simply. An example of that, one of my favorites, in Earth of the New Sun, towards the end, Asopega was talking to Severian, and he's talking about the essence of what he is. You know, his body's all over the place, and how is this going on? He describes, you know, if you write your name on the wall over here, and you write your name on the wall over here, you know, it's still you. There's something that exists beyond that, you know, and in the context of, well, you know, he's jumping through time at various points here. And so when you bring these two things together, it's like writing it in the dust and writing one name just over the other, so naturally they'll come together, and, you know, like electricity going in the same circuit. That was a wonderful visual that I had to take a very large idea, but make it very concrete, and especially because we've seen the character physically do this abstract idea in the physical world of the book. That was mind blowing to me. That was another time I had to set down the book and just think about it for a minute. But I love that part. But
Very flattered by what you said.
but do you ever, in the course of your writing, try to wrap your own mind around an idea that you're playing with, and then just kind of leave it as a mystery? I mean, is that ever present? Is that
Sure. Lots of times. That's part of the game, and I could sit down and write an explanation of the idea, but I couldn't sell it. If I write something, a piece of fiction that includes the idea and what's going on and so forth, I could probably sell that.
Kind of going back to the short stories and novels topic, do you think that if an idea can be expanded to a novel length, it should be necessarily?
If it can be expanded to the length of a good novel, it's easy to take an idea and write however many thousand words you have for a novel. And no difficulty about that, but is what you've written worth reading? Because if it holds only the kind of simple stuff that you get from one short story, then the answer is probably no. May not be, but probably it's no.
I want to touch on some other themes that folks have brought up. Water seems to play an important role in many of your works, and especially the mystery of it and the powers that exist within it. Thinking specifically things like the Undines in the Book of the New Sun, or the Storm King and Evil Guest, something like that. Is there some symbolic connection to that essence of water that you are specifically drawing out, or?
Well, I think certainly so. If you've been around, have you been around salt water to any great extent? Lived on the seacoast, been on ships at sea.
I live on the shores of Lake Superior, so I'm familiar with that.
Well,
the boating there.
that's close enough. Here it is, and it's a world to itself, and the bottom of the seas particularly have been unexplored and are, some people say they're less well-known than the surface of Mars, which I don't believe for my own reasons. Mars has it has 2-mile deep crevices in it. And if you read about the Martian atmosphere, they will tell you that it's like the atmosphere of Earth at the top of a mountain. And therefore, it seems to me that if you're going to find life on Mars, you're going to find it down in those crevices. How much life do you get on a mountaintop on Earth? Damn little, right? Water runs downhill for one reason, and it tends to be icy and snowy far more than the lower parts do. So let's go down in the crevices, let's look at what's down there. We know that we can put a lander on the surface of Mars, but we're always up on the plateau, you know. I remember the Devil's Tower. You've probably heard about this before, but the Devil's Tower had never been climbed, and some people set out an expedition to climb it, and they finally did. And when they got to the top, they discovered some pop bottles and worn out automobile tires and so on, because there was this joker who had read about what they were doing and had flown over in an airplane and thrown this stuff out of an airplane without landing in, you know, it was too rough for them to land there. But you could carry the Coke bottles and the tires and stuff and push them out of the plane, which is what he did. They found, you know, empty cigarette packages and stuff.
Well, gentlemen, we have reached our time of being able to spend another hour with Gene Wolfe. I want to thank Andrew and David very much for agreeing to be on interview.
Thank you, Bill.
Hey, if you like Gene Wolfe's stories, there's actually a podcast about his stories called Gene Wolfe Literary Podcast. I have some cards here, and they go through the writings of Gene Wolfe one story at a time. I estimate it's probably going to take to the year 2767 until they finish up the stories. They're in the middle of the 5th head of Cerberus right now. So I have some cards here with information on that. Check it out. I've been following it along. And the nice thing is at the end of one episode, they tell you, next episode we're going to be reading this, and here's where you can get it. You can find it in this book or that book, especially with short stories. Anyway.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Yeah, very much.